On the 28th of May of 1588, the most formidable fleet ever to cross the oceans sailed from Lisbon under the banner of the Hispanic monarchy. 130 ships, 8,000 seasoned sailors, and 18,000 of the finest soldiers of the Spanish Empire prepared to carry out the Enterprise of England, an operation meant to change the course of European history. The galleons, some weighing more than 1,000 tons, formed an imposing armada whose sails rose like a floating city ready to conquer. Philip II, the most powerful monarch in the world, had invested resources equivalent to billions of euros today in this fleet, convinced that victory was guaranteed by divine providence. The strategy looked flawless on paper. The Great Armada would sail through the English Channel, join forces with the veteran tercios of Flanders, commanded by Alessandro Farnese, and execute the most ambitious amphibious landing in history. England, ruled by the heretic Elizabeth I, would find itself defenseless before this display of naval and military might. However, what unfolded over the next 4 months would become one of the most studied and misunderstood episodes in naval history. The reality, revealed through historical documents and archaeological findings, tells a very different story from the version popularized by British propaganda. This is not the chronicle of an invincible fleet defeated by heroic sailors, but the tragedy of a war machine designed for Mediterranean combat, facing the relentless realities of the North Atlantic. It is the story of how strategic arrogance, logistical failures, and an obsolete naval doctrine turned what should have been a certain victory into a foretold disaster. Across the centuries, the scattered wrecks from the coasts of Cornwall to the cliffs of Ireland have silently guarded the forensic evidence of what truly happened. The cannons recovered from the seabed, the survivors' journals, and the remains of the once majestic galleons speak of an uncomfortable truth. The Great Armada was not destroyed primarily by English guns, but by its own structural weaknesses and desperate tactical decisions. In this forensic investigation of a naval disaster, we will follow the trail of historical documents, analyze the archaeological evidence, and reconstruct the critical moments that turned the pride of the Spanish Empire into a floating graveyard. From the ports of Lisbon to the storm-lashed coasts of Ireland, from the halls of El Escorial to the naval battlefields of the English Channel, this is the full chronicle of how 26,000 men embarked on an impossible mission, and how only a third of them returned to tell the tale. But to understand the magnitude of this failure, we must begin not at sea, but in the minds of the two monarchs whose personal conflict dragged their empires into a confrontation neither could afford to lose. The conflict between Philip II of Spain and Elizabeth I of England went far beyond a simple territorial or commercial dispute. It was the clash of two irreconcilable visions for the future of Europe. Philip II, the prudent king, ruled the largest empire on earth, stretching from the American viceroyalties to the Italian and Flemish territories. His court at El Escorial was the nerve center of a monarchy that saw itself as the defender of Catholicism in a continent fractured by the Protestant Reformation. For Philip, the enterprise of England was not merely a military operation, but a religious crusade meant to free English Catholics from what he considered the heretical tyranny of Elizabeth I. Reports from his ambassadors painted England as a divided kingdom, where thousands of Catholics secretly awaited the arrival of a Spanish liberator. On the other side, Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, had turned her realm into a constant challenge to Spanish supremacy. Under her rule, England became a safe harbour for pirates like Francis Drake, whose raids on Spanish ports and fleets in the Americas consistently weakened the Crown's revenues. The execution of Mary Stuart, a Catholic and claimant to the English throne, in the year 1587, was the final straw for Philip II. But beyond the religious conflict lay a geopolitical struggle for control of Atlantic trade. England openly challenged the commercial monopoly Spain claimed over the Americas, while Spain sought to strangle its rival economically by blocking its trade routes. Tensions had been escalating since 1585, when Elizabeth I signed the Treaty of Nonsuch, committing to military support for the Dutch rebels against Spanish rule. For Philip II, this was an intolerable intrusion into what he considered his rightful domains. The breaking point came in 1587, when Drake attacked Cadiz in a bold raid, the Spanish would later call the singing of the King's beard. The Spanish fleet suffered serious damage, and even worse, the San Felipe galleon, loaded with crucial supplies for the planned invasion, was captured. This setback delayed preparations by a vital year, giving the English time to strengthen their defences. While Philip II planned his grand offensive from his monastic cell in El Escorial, Elizabeth I mobilised her kingdom for war. Although aware of her navy's numerical inferiority, the English Queen trusted in the quality of her ships and the experience of her sailors. The stage was set for a confrontation neither monarch could avoid. For Philip II, it was a matter of imperial honour and religious duty. For Elizabeth I, a fight for national survival. Two worldviews, two concepts of sovereignty, and two stubborn rulers were marching inexorably toward a clash that would shape the fate of the Atlantic for centuries. The Great and Most Fortunate Armada, its true official name, was an impressive gathering of ships that hid serious structural weaknesses beneath an appearance of overwhelming power. The 130 vessels that sailed from Lisbon represented the finest elements of Spanish naval architecture, but they also exposed the limits of a military doctrine trapped in the past. The galleons, the flagship vessels of the fleet, were floating fortresses designed mainly for transporting riches from the Americas and for boarding combat. With their towering fore and aft castles, these ships offered excellent platforms for infantry, but their design made them slow and difficult to maneuver in the conditions of the English Channel. Modern analyses of archaeological remains show that Spanish galleons had a length-to-beam ratio poorly suited for sailing in restricted waters, limiting their ability to turn quickly when facing more agile ships. Alongside the galleons sailed 4 galleasses, true naval monsters representing the final evolution of Mediterranean galleys. These vessels, with multiple banks of oars and powerful artillery batteries, were terrifying in theory, but their low freeboard made them extremely vulnerable in rough seas. Contemporary accounts describe how the galleasses barely managed to stay afloat in the North Atlantic, and how their rowing systems became useless against the winds and currents of the Channel. The heterogeneity of the fleet was another fundamental issue. Alongside the mighty galleons of the Indies route sailed Dutch hulks, scouting pataches, Cantabrian zabras, and repurposed merchant naos. This diversity, while reflective of the multinational nature of the Spanish Empire, made tactical coordination enormously complicated. Each type of ship had different speeds, handling characteristics and response capabilities, making it nearly impossible to maintain a cohesive formation during naval operations. Spain's artillery system, though numerically impressive with more than 2,400 pieces, suffered from deep structural problems. Spanish cannons, mostly cast iron and generally heavy, were designed for close-range, low-trajectory fire, perfect for boarding actions but ineffective in long-distance engagements. Furthermore, Spanish naval doctrine prioritized conserving ammunition for the final assault, which severely limited their ability to respond during prolonged artillery duels. Inventories from the time reveal that while English ships carried abundant reserves of gunpowder and shot for attritional combat, the Spanish had calculated their supplies for a decisive close-quarters encounter. This difference in combat philosophy would prove fatal when the Armada encountered an English fleet determined to avoid close combat at all costs. The Spanish War Machine, built for a type of warfare that was rapidly becoming obsolete, suddenly found itself facing a tactical revolution for which it was utterly unprepared. Do you think we might be making similar mistakes today, relying on strategies from the past to confront completely new challenges? The choice of Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, 7th Duke of Medina Sidonia, as commander of the Great Armada has been one of the most debated aspects of the entire campaign. Traditional historiography, heavily influenced by British propaganda, portrayed the Duke as an incompetent, cowardly aristocrat, a mere courtier elevated to a position far beyond his abilities. Yet a closer examination of contemporary documents reveals a far more complex and nuanced reality. Medina Sidonia, 37 years old in 1588, was one of the richest and most powerful nobles in Spain, with extensive administrative experience as superintendent of the Indies fleet. His knowledge of naval logistics was, in fact, exceptional for the time, having organized numerous commercial fleets bound for the Americas. When Philip II offered him the command after the unexpected death of the experienced Marquis of Santa Cruz, Medina Sidonia replied with an extraordinarily honest letter that should have sounded every alarm in the Spanish court. In his message to the king, the Duke listed his limitations with precision. "I have no experience of the sea or of war," he wrote, adding that his health was fragile and that he suffered frequent seasickness during voyages. This remarkable display of self-awareness, far from being an act of cowardice, revealed a man fully conscious of the enormous responsibility he was being given. Philip II's decision to insist on his appointment reflected the very nature of the operation. The king was not seeking chiefly a combat admiral, but a logistical organizer capable of coordinating the complex union with the tercios of Flanders. From this perspective, Medina Sidonia was a logical choice. His experience managing large commercial fleets made him the ideal candidate for an operation that prioritized the safe transport of troops over pure naval combat. However, this logic would prove catastrophically flawed when the Armada was forced into naval engagements for which its commander was not prepared. The shipboard journals depict a Medina Sidonia who was meticulous and concerned for the welfare of his men, yet also indecisive at critical moments that demanded tactical boldness. His correspondence reveals growing desperation as it became clear that coordinating with Farnese's tercios was impossible, and that the English fleet possessed a decisive tactical advantage. The personal tragedy of Medina Sidonia encapsulates the fundamental failure of the entire campaign. He was a competent administrator placed in charge of an operation that required a warrior. His later record would show that, under normal circumstances, he was perfectly capable of defending the Spanish coast against English attacks, as he would successfully do during Drake's counterattack in 1589. But in 1588, he found himself commanding a fleet for which he was not prepared, executing a flawed strategy, and facing an enemy that had revolutionized the art of naval warfare. His figure, so often caricatured by history, is in truth the victim of a system that prioritized loyalty over competence, logistics over tactics, and divine hope over military reality. The logistical problems that plagued the Great Armada began long before its ships departed from Lisbon and constituted one of the most decisive factors in its failure. The accumulated delays in preparation, particularly after Drake's attack on Cadiz in 1587, forced the fleet to remain in port for months, consuming provisions that should have been reserved for the voyage. By the time the Armada finally set sail on the 28th of May, 1588, it had already been living off its own strategic reserves for weeks. Supply records reveal an alarming situation. Barrels of water made from green wood that had not had time to cure properly began leaking almost immediately, contaminating the precious liquid with seawater and rot. Hardtack, the crew's main sustenance, had been stored in unsuitable conditions and was infested with weevils. Salted meat, another staple of the naval diet, showed advanced signs of spoilage. But the most serious problem was the chronic shortage of fresh provisions. As the fleet regrouped in La Coruña after a storm scattered it shortly after departure, Medina Sidonia wrote desperate letters to the court, warning of the critical state of supplies. His requests for more fresh fruits and vegetables were largely ignored or met with insufficient shipments. The consequences were swift. Scurvy, the terrible disease caused by a vitamin C deficiency, began to ravage the crew. Symptoms: bleeding gums, teeth falling out, wounds that would not heal, progressively weakened sailors and soldiers alike. Alongside scurvy, dysentery spread like wildfire across the cramped and unsanny decks. The overcrowded conditions, with up to 500 men packed into spaces meant for half that number, turned the ships into incubators for disease. Primitive sanitary systems, basically just planks suspended over the sea, were useless when men were too weak to use them. Shipboard diaries describe harrowing scenes. Sailors too weak to handle the sails, soldiers unable to wield their weapons, officers making decisions while running high fevers. Contemporary medicine, relying on bloodletting and ineffective herbal remedies, could do little against these illnesses. By the time the Armada finally entered the English Channel in late July, it is estimated that up to a third of the crew was seriously ill or incapacitated. This human weakness translated directly into operational incapacity. Maneuvers that should have been executed with precision became clumsy and slow, lookouts failed from fatigue, and morale sank faster than any ship. The broken logistical chain not only deprived the Armada of food and drinking water, but also stole its most precious asset: the physical and mental capability of its men. While the English fought from nearby ports where they could constantly resupply, the Spanish depended on supplies that dwindled day by day. This logistical asymmetry, perhaps more than any tactical or technological superiority, doomed the Great Armada from the very moment its anchors were lifted in Lisbon. The confrontation in the English Channel represented the clash of two diametrically opposed naval philosophies, a conflict of doctrines that would determine the outcome of the campaign long before the first cannon was fired. On one side, the Spanish Armada embodied the Mediterranean naval tradition, where combat was conceived as an extension of land warfare. Its strategy relied on tight formations, the famous half-moon, designed to protect the most vulnerable ships and facilitate mass boarding. Spanish galleons functioned essentially as floating fortresses. Their high fore and aft castles offered ideal defensive positions for arquebusiers, while their decks were crowded with elite infantry ready for close-quarters combat. Artillery, although numerous, played a secondary role. It was meant to weaken the enemy at close range to allow boarding, but was never conceived as the primary instrument of victory. Spanish tactical manuals prescribed strict fire control. Cannons were to be reserved for short distances, aimed at the waterline, to sink the enemy quickly. This doctrine, effective in the Mediterranean and in convoy defense, would prove catastrophically inadequate in the open waters of the Channel. In contrast, the English fleet represented an emerging naval revolution. Under the tactical leadership of seamen like Drake, Hawkins, and Frobisher, the English had developed an entirely new doctrine focused on mobility and firepower. Their galleons, lower, narrower, and remarkably more maneuverable than their Spanish counterparts, were specifically designed as mobile artillery platforms. The English strategy was simple, yet devastatingly effective. Maintain distance, exploit superior speed and maneuverability, and constantly punish the Spanish ships with cannon fire aimed at their rigging and masts. While the Spanish desperately sought to close in for boarding, the English stayed elegantly out of reach, turning the Spanish tight formation into a stationary target. Records of the engagements show an overwhelming tactical asymmetry. The Spanish fired sparingly, seeking a decisive impact, while the English fired continuously, aiming for progressive incapacitation. This difference was reflected even in the ship complements. While a Spanish galleon carried hundreds of soldiers for boarding, its English equivalent prioritized gunners and sailors needed for evasive maneuvers. Spanish frustration is evident in period diaries, where commanders repeatedly complained about the English refusal to engage in the honourable boarding combat. What the Spanish saw as cowardice was in fact a sophisticated understanding of modern naval warfare. The Battle of Gravelines, the campaign's most decisive engagement, would conclusively demonstrate the superiority of the new doctrine. While the Spanish waited to board, English fireships broke their formation, and British artillery turned the retreat into a slaughter. This collision of doctrines was not merely a historical accident. It marked the moment when medieval naval warfare, centered on embarked infantry, gave way to modern naval warfare, dominated by artillery and mobility. The voyage of the Spanish Armada through the English Channel became a logistical and psychological nightmare that foreshadowed the final disaster. From its entry into the Channel on the 30th of July, 1588, the Spanish fleet found itself trapped in a deadly race against time, the elements, and an enemy that refused to fight on its terms. The half-moon formation, so impressive on the strategists' plans in Madrid, proved to be a tactical trap in the narrow waters of the Channel. The slower ships, particularly the heavy supply hulks and the almost unmanageable galleasses, forced the entire fleet to maintain a speed that the English could easily surpass. Ship diaries describe the growing frustration of the Spanish commanders as they watched the agile English galleons approach, fire their broadsides, and retreat with impunity before the Spaniards could respond effectively. On the 6th of August, off the Isle of Wight, one of the campaign's most critical moments occurred. The Spanish fleet, still relatively intact, had the opportunity to capture an English port that could have served as a base of operations. Medina Sidonia's advisors, particularly the experienced Miguel de Oquendo, urged the Duke to order an attack on Portsmouth. But Medina Sidonia, faithful to his instructions to prioritize the union with the tercios of Flanders, rejected the proposal. This decision, perhaps the most controversial of the entire campaign, deprived the Armada of its last real chance to change the course of events. Meanwhile, communication with Alejandro Farnese in the Netherlands proved to be another broken link in the strategic chain. Messages sent via small liaison ships were delayed or never arrived, and when they did, they brought discouraging news. The tercios were not ready for immediate embarkation. The Flemish ports were too shallow for the large Spanish galleons, and the rebellious Dutch fleet blocked access routes. The Armada found itself trapped in a logistical nightmare. It could not advance toward Calais without first securing coordination with Farnese, yet it could not retreat without abandoning the mission. On the 7th of August, the fleet anchored off Calais in a position that would prove fatal. The formation, while protecting the most vulnerable ships, made them stationary targets for the next English tactical innovation, the fire ships. That night, 8 incendiary vessels were launched against the Spanish formation, with the tide in their favor. Panic gripped the fleet. Captains, ignoring orders to hold position, cut their anchor cables in a desperate attempt to escape the flames. The carefully arranged half-moon formation disintegrated within minutes, leaving the ships individually vulnerable. At dawn on the 8th of August, the Armada was scattered and disorganized, with many ships having lost their main anchors in flight. The Battle of Gravelines that followed would be the point of no return. Without a cohesive formation and with numerous ships damaged, the Armada was forced into an artillery engagement for which it was unprepared. Tactical defeat was now inevitable, but the true disaster was only just beginning. On the 8th of August, 1588, in the shallow waters off Gravelines, the battle that would decide the fate of the Spanish Armada, and with it, the course of European history, was fought. The Spanish fleet, disorganized after the fireship attack the previous night, was at its most vulnerable. Many ships had lost their anchors during the chaotic flight and struggled to maintain position against unfavorable winds and currents. The English, aware of their advantage, launched their attack with a ferocity that surprised even the veteran Spaniards. What followed was a devastating demonstration of modern naval warfare. The English galleons, taking advantage of their superior maneuverability, executed successive passes against the most damaged Spanish ships, concentrating their artillery fire on the already weakened hulls. English artillery superiority became evident immediately. While the Spaniards fired sporadically, aiming for the waterline, the English maintained constant fire directed at the rigging and masts, seeking to immobilize their opponents. The San Mateo, one of the most powerful galleons of the Portuguese squadron, became a symbol of the carnage. Surrounded by several English ships, it received more than 200 cannon hits before being boarded. Survivor accounts describe nightmarish scenes: decks literally drenched in blood, shattered masts, and corpses piled like firewood. Aboard the San Martin, Medina Sidonia's flagship, the situation was equally desperate. The Duke, wounded by wooden splinters, continued directing the battle as his ship endured volley after volley. Spanish attempts to counterattack were repeatedly frustrated by English mobility. Each time a Spanish galleon tried to close for boarding, its English opponent simply retreated, turning to present a new broadside. The battle lasted for 8 relentless hours, with the changing tide adding another layer of chaos to the confrontation. Modern calculations estimate that the English fired roughly 3 times as many projectiles as the Spaniards, a difference reflecting not only distinct tactical doctrines, but also superior logistical preparation. When the battle finally ceased at dusk, the scene was desolate. At least 5 Spanish ships had been sunk or captured, and dozens more were seriously damaged. But more significant than the material losses was the collapse of morale and discipline. That night, aboard the San Martin, Medina Sidonia attempted to regroup the formation by firing the 3 customary cannon shots signaling assembly. The response was disappointing. Only a few ships obeyed the signal. Most, damaged or simply demoralized, began drifting northward. Widespread disobedience marked the moment when the Spanish Armada ceased to be a cohesive fighting force and became a collection of individual ships struggling for survival. The following day, the 9th of August, Medina Sidonia convened a council of war aboard the San Martin. The situation was critical. Without anchors to hold position, with southwest winds preventing a return through the channel, and with the English fleet still in pursuit, the options were reduced to one. The decision made in the coming hours would condemn thousands of men to a nightmare far greater than the battle they had just survived. Faced with a seemingly inescapable situation, should leaders cling to the original plan or adapt to changing realities, even if it means admitting failure? The Council of War, held aboard the San Martin on the 9th of August, 1588, faced a historic dilemma. On one hand, attempting to return through the English Channel meant confronting the English fleet once more, now reinforced and with morale soaring. On the other, continuing northward meant venturing into unknown waters, without accurate charts and with a fleet already severely damaged. The final decision, to sail around the British Isles to the north, has been judged by history as a catastrophic error, but a detailed analysis of the circumstances reveals that the alternatives were equally grim. Weather reports of the time, preserved in Spanish and English archives, show that the prevailing southwest winds made the return route through the Channel virtually impossible. Any attempt to force passage southward would have meant sailing against the wind, an extremely slow and dangerous task for damaged ships with exhausted crews. Furthermore, French and Flemish ports were closed to the Spaniards, and the English controlled their own coasts. The option of seeking refuge in Scottish ports, theoretically possible given the Catholicism of James VI, was dismissed due to lack of guarantees and fear of betrayal. The northern route, though dangerous, offered a crucial advantage. It allowed them to harness the prevailing winds and ocean currents circulating counterclockwise around the British Isles. From a purely nautical perspective, it was the most logical choice, though also the riskiest. What the Spaniards could not anticipate was the exceptional severity of the weather they would encounter in the North Atlantic during the summer of 1588. Climatic records, reconstructed by modern paleoclimatologists, indicate that 1588 was a particularly stormy year, with a succession of gales that battered the coasts of Scotland and Ireland with unusual violence. Medina Sidonia's order, transmitted via flag signals and cannon shots, specified a precise route: maintain a northern course until reaching the latitude of the Shetland Islands, then turn west to circle Ireland to the north, and finally descend towards Spain across the open Atlantic. But the execution of this order was compromised from the start by the state of the fleet. Many ships had lost their anchors during the flight from Calais, leaving them extremely vulnerable in storms. Others sailed with damaged rigging and shredded sails, unable to maintain course in adverse conditions. The shortage of provisions became critical. Drinking water was rationed to the minimum. The weevil-infested biscuits constituted the only available food, and disease continued to decimate the crews. The most eloquent testimony of the desperation surrounding this decision comes from Don Alonso de Leyva, one of the most respected commanders of the Armada, who described the route as that voyage of Magellan, an analogy reflecting the perception that they were embarking on a journey as long and perilous as the first circumnavigation of the globe. The tragic irony is that as the Spaniards began their ordeal northward, the English fleet pursued them only nominally. As the experienced Juan Martínez de Recalde had anticipated, the English offered a silver bridge to the Spaniards, trusting that the sea would do the dirty work. By the 12th of August, when the last Spanish ships disappeared over the northern horizon, the naval campaign had ended, but the true human tragedy was only beginning. The northern return route around the British Isles became a meteorological nightmare that far exceeded the horrors of naval combat. As the Grand Armada ventured into more northern latitudes, it encountered conditions for which neither its ships nor its crews were prepared. The North Atlantic storms, particularly severe in the summer of 1588, battered the fleet with a force that the ship logs describe with religious terror. The first major storm struck the Armada off the coast of Scotland in mid-August. For ships already damaged in combat, with improvised rigging and crews weakened by scurvy and dysentery, these storms proved devastating. The galleons, designed for the relatively calm waters of the Mediterranean and the South Atlantic, were extraordinarily vulnerable to the giant waves and hurricane-force winds of the north. The lack of accurate nautical charts for these waters became a lethal factor. Spanish pilots, accustomed to navigating southern latitudes, constantly underestimated the strength of currents and the proximity of treacherous coastlines. The concept of the Protestant wind, the idea that God had miraculously intervened in favour of England, was born from this catastrophic combination of bad weather and navigational errors. But the reality was more prosaic and far more terrible. The Armada was not destroyed by divine intervention, but by a chain of causality that began with strategic mistakes and ended with the fortuitous encounter with some of the worst storms of the century in the North Atlantic. By the end of August, the fleet, now completely scattered, began to reach the treacherous coasts of Ireland. Here the final chapter of the tragedy unfolded. The ships, disoriented by fog and torrential rains, unknowingly approached a rocky coastline that stretched like a deadly trap for over 500 kilometers. The wreck of La Girona off the coast of Antrim became the symbol of this final slaughter. The Galleass, one of the fleet's most powerful ships, smashed against the reefs of Port Ballintrae in October of 1588. Of the estimated 1,300 men aboard, only 9 survived. The wreck of La Trinidad Valenciera in Kinago Bay was equally catastrophic. 400 survivors who reached the shore were massacred by English troops in what became known as the Ilag Massacre. English records of the time justified these killings by arguing that the Spaniards represented an invasion threat even in their defenseless state. The reality was far darker. Many English soldiers saw the shipwrecked as potential sources of loot, and authorities feared that surviving Spaniards might join the Irish Catholic rebels. The northwest coast of Ireland became a maritime graveyard of biblical proportions. From Donegal to Kerry, the remnants of the once proud Armada lay shattered against cliffs and beaches. Irish peasants, many of them Catholic sympathisers of the Spanish cause, risked their lives to aid survivors, but their efforts were insufficient against the scale of the disaster. By the time the first Spanish ships managed to return to northern Spanish ports in late September of 1588, the full extent of the catastrophe became clear. Of the 130 ships that had set sail, only 67 returned, many in such poor condition that they had to be broken up. Of the approximately 26,000 men who made up the expedition, it is estimated that only about 10,000 survived. Most of the losses had not occurred in battle, but from disease, starvation, and shipwreck during the disastrous return voyage. The vengeance of the sea had been more efficient and merciless than all the English cannons combined. For the unfortunate Spaniards who managed to survive the shipwrecks along the Irish coasts, escaping the fury of the sea only meant facing an equally terrible death on land. The autumn of 1588 became a season of horror along the western coast of Ireland, where the remnants of the Grand Armada and its dying crews washed ashore, wave after wave. The systematic massacre of Spanish shipwreck survivors stands as one of the darkest and least known chapters of the entire campaign. Documents from the English administration in Dublin reveal a deliberate policy of summary execution for any Spaniard captured. Lord Deputy William Fitzwilliam, the highest representative of the English Crown in Ireland, issued explicit orders to take no prisoners, arguing that they had no means to feed or guard them, and that they represented a potential fifth column that could join the Irish rebels. The most documented episode of this slaughter occurred at Ilag, near Sligo, where about 400 survivors of the La Trinidad Valenciera shipwreck were massacred after being disarmed. Testimonies collected by Spanish missionaries years later describe how English soldiers, under the command of Colonel Richard Bingham, systematically executed the exhausted survivors, spearing them and shooting them with arquebuses while they lay helpless on the beach. The official justification, that the Spaniards represented a military threat even in their state of total defenselessness, did not hide the reality of looting. English soldiers methodically rifled through the corpses, searching for gold coins, jewellery, and any valuable objects that Spanish nobles and officers had managed to save from the wreck. But not all Irish communities followed these orders. In some regions, particularly where loyalty to the English crown was weak and Catholicism remained strong, locals risked their lives to protect the Spanish survivors. In County Clare, the local chieftain Boetius Clancy openly defied the English authorities, sheltering a group of survivors. In other areas, Irish peasants hid Spaniards in their cottages, provided them with dry clothes and food, and helped them escape to territories controlled by friendlier Gaelic lords. These acts of compassion, however, were the exception rather than the rule. Most Spaniards who reached land faced a terrible fate, either starving and exposed to the elements if they evaded the English soldiers, or being summarily executed if they fell into their hands. Parish records from Irish coastal towns contain grim notes about mass burials of Spanish strangers during the autumn of 1588. The scale of the human tragedy is hard to overstate. It is estimated that between 5,000 and 6,000 Spaniards lost their lives along the Irish coasts, either drowned in shipwrecks or executed after reaching the relative safety of dry land. For the few fortunate enough to escape this double trap of sea and sword, the journey back to Spain was an odyssey in itself. Some were rescued by Spanish ships searching for survivors along the Irish coast. Others made it to Scotland, where James VI, although officially neutral, allowed their repatriation. A few even found permanent refuge in Ireland, integrating into local communities where their descendants would carry the memory of their Spanish origins for generations. The massacre on Irish soil represents the bitterest epilogue of the Armada campaign, a sombre reminder that the naval tragedy was, above all, a human catastrophe of colossal proportions. The shipwrecks of the Grand Armada, scattered from the coasts of Scotland to southern Ireland, have provided underwater archaeologists with a unique window into the human and material drama of 1588. Each discovered wreck tells a part of the story, revealing details that written documents could not capture. The treasure of La Girona, recovered in 1968 off the coast of Antrim, represents perhaps the most emblematic find. The Galleass, which sank in October 1588 with over 1,000 men aboard, held in its remains a trove of personal objects that humanized the tragedy in a moving way. Among the artifacts recovered is the famous salamander brooch, a gold amulet symbolizing protection against fire, a constant concern on 16th century wooden ships. The presence of this object speaks to the superstition and hope that sailors carried with them even on their final voyage. The more than 400 gold and silver coins recovered from the wreck represented not only wealth but also the personal ambitions of nobles and officers who hoped to establish new lives in a conquered England. Each coin told a story of frustrated ambition, of dreams of glory and riches reduced to rubble on the seabed. The wreck of La Trinidad Valenciera in Kinago Bay, discovered in 1971, provides another crucial perspective on the disaster. The remains of this large galleon have revealed material evidence of the massacre that followed the shipwreck. Archaeologists recovered weapons and military equipment, showing signs of deliberate disabling or concealment, suggesting the desperate attempts of survivors to surrender before being executed. Findings at this site confirm historical accounts of the presence of the Naples Tercios on board, including distinctive insignia and specific equipment of these elite units. Even more revealing was the discovery of human remains showing injuries consistent with summary executions, providing forensic evidence that corroborates accounts of massacres. But Armada archaeology is not limited to spectacular wrecks. Smaller wrecks, such as a potash discovered at Stredag Strand, tell equally eloquent stories. At this site, archaeologists found the remains of 3 smaller ships that sank together, preserved in the shifting sands of the Irish coast. The objects recovered here, from cooking utensils to navigational instruments, offer an intimate glimpse into daily life aboard the Armada's ships. A particularly poignant discovery was a set of carved bone dice, a silent testament to how sailors tried to entertain themselves during long and tedious voyages. Underwater archaeology has also allowed verification of technical aspects of the campaign. Analysis of the recovered cannons confirmed the doctrinal differences between the Spanish and English fleets. While the Spanish prioritized heavy guns for close combat, the English used lighter cannons with a higher rate of fire. The study of hulls revealed the structural limitations of Spanish galleons in the conditions of the North Atlantic. Even evidence of improvised repairs, patched hulls, replaced masts, and makeshift rigging speaks to the desperate struggle to keep the ships afloat during the disastrous return voyage. Collectively, these archaeological findings have transformed our understanding of the Armada disaster. They are no longer just numbers in a historical document. They are personal stories of ambition, fear, ingenuity, and suffering, preserved on the seabed for more than 4 centuries and now finally revealed to tell the true story of one of the most dramatic episodes in European naval history. The label Invincible Armada is one of the most persistent and misleading myths in history. Contrary to popular belief, the term did not arise from Spanish arrogance, but as English propaganda sarcasm. Contemporary Spanish documents refer to the fleet with much more modest names: Great and Most Fortunate Armada, or simply the Enterprise of England. It was Elizabeth I's propaganda machine that, after the fleet's dispersal, began calling it Invincible in a mocking tone, creating a slogan that endures to this day. The myth was built immediately after the disaster. Medallions were minted with the inscription Afflavit Deus et dissipati sunt, God blew and they were scattered, to celebrate what was presented as divine intervention in favor of England. The so-called Protestant wind became a symbol of heavenly protection over the Protestant cause, consolidating popular support for Elizabeth I and English naval identity. In the Netherlands, in the midst of rebellion, Engravings and pamphlets grotesquely exaggerated the Spanish defeat, amplifying the perception that Spain had been irreversibly broken. The reality was different. The Armada suffered a tactical defeat and a logistical disaster, but the Spanish Empire retained its capacity for recovery. Even the English fleet, though tactically superior, was exhausted and had expended most of its ammunition. The English counter-armada the following year would demonstrate that their dominance was not absolute. The myth, however, endured. For England, Spain's defeat became a cornerstone of its identity as a seafaring nation destined to dominate the oceans. For Spain, it became a symbol of decline, despite the empire maintaining its naval predominance for decades. The final irony is that English mockery gave the Spanish Armada an enduring fame. In popular imagination, the Invincible Armada remains far more remembered than all the successful fleets Spain would send afterward. This myth demonstrates that sometimes the power of a good story can outweigh even the truth of events. The traditional narrative regarding the consequences of the Spanish Armada's disaster has tended to portray it as the turning point, marking the irreversible decline of the Spanish Empire and the unstoppable rise of British power. However, a detailed examination of the years immediately following 1588 reveals a far more complex and surprising historical reality: the remarkable capacity for recovery of the Spanish monarchy. Far from collapsing under the weight of defeat, the Spanish Empire demonstrated extraordinary resilience, rebuilding its naval power at a pace that astonished contemporaries. The most eloquent documentary evidence of this recovery can be found in the Crown's financial records. Although Philip II had reported a cost of 10 million ducats for the Armada, an astronomical sum for the time, recent research, such as that of historian Carlos Alvarez Nogal, has questioned the traditional interpretation that this expenditure caused an immediate collapse of the royal treasury. Analysis of the Crown's accounts shows no financial collapse as British propaganda claimed. On the contrary, it reveals the existence of fiscal and credit mechanisms robust enough to absorb the blow and fund the reconstruction. This economic resilience translated into a remarkable naval recovery. In the years following 1588, Spain not only rebuilt its fleet, but launched new armadas against England. The most notable was the Armada of 1597, a fleet almost as large as that of 1588, demonstrating that Spanish naval capacity was far from destroyed. Although this second armada also failed due to storms, its very existence disproves the narrative of Spanish military collapse. Material recovery is also evidenced by the efforts to reuse surviving resources from the disaster. As documented in the archives of the Casa de Contratación, the Crown organized systematic operations to recover artillery and other equipment from the sunken ships. One documented case is that of La Regasona, one of the few galleons that returned to Spain in a condition suitable for repair. From this ship, more than 1,500 artillery projectiles were recovered and immediately reused to reinforce Spanish coastal defenses, particularly in La Coruña. This efficiency in resource management demonstrates an imperial bureaucracy fully capable of learning from disasters and adapting to new circumstances. Spanish resilience also manifested in the strategic sphere. Unable to repeat the strategy of direct invasion, Philip II adapted his tactics toward a war of attrition against English interests. Under his direction, Spain strengthened the Indies fleet system, improved port defences in the Caribbean, and developed new naval tactics that would prove more successful against the English threat. The Spanish victory over the English counter-armada of 1589 demonstrated that, in defence of its territory, the Spanish navy remained a formidable force. This capacity for adaptation and recovery explains why Spain was able to continue the war against England for 16 more years, until the signing of the Treaty of London in 1604. A treaty that, significantly, was far more favourable to Spain than the traditional narrative suggests. The resilience of the Spanish Empire after the Armada disaster offers a crucial historical lesson. The true power of an empire is not measured by its individual victories or defeats, but by its ability to absorb blows, learn from mistakes, and reorganize to continue the struggle. Far from being the beginning of the end, 1588 represented for Spain a painful but not fatal lesson, a setback from which it recovered with remarkable speed and effectiveness. The disaster of the Great Armada of 1588 continues to resonate across the centuries, not only as a fascinating historical episode, but as a timeless case study on the limits of power and the consequences of strategic arrogance. The lessons emerging from this naval tragedy transcend its specific historical context, offering enduring insights into the nature of leadership, military planning, and the dangers of overconfidence. The first and most obvious lesson is the peril of confusing scale with effectiveness. The Spanish Armada was undeniably impressive in size and appearance, but this magnificence concealed serious structural and conceptual deficiencies. The fleet had been designed for a type of warfare that was already becoming obsolete, while its enemy had embraced tactical innovations that would redefine naval combat for centuries. This dissonance between appearance and reality serves as an eternal reminder that in strategy, as in engineering, form must always follow function. The second lesson concerns the limits of centralized planning. The enterprise of England had been meticulously planned from Philip II's court, yet these plans suffered from a rigidity that made them vulnerable to uncertainty and changing circumstances. The critical dependence on coordination with the Tercios of Flanders created a single point of failure that, when it failed, doomed the entire operation. The inability to adapt to unexpected realities, from the impossibility of communicating with Farnese to the English refusal to fight according to Spanish rules, demonstrated the dangers of planning that does not incorporate flexibility and contingency. The third lesson concerns leadership selection. The choice of Medina Sidonia, while understandable from a logistical perspective, ignored the fundamental reality that the campaign required both a combat admiral and an administrator. This decision reflects a perennial tendency in large organizations, the propensity to prioritize loyalty and administration over specific competence and tactical aptitude. The fourth lesson emerges from the interaction between technology and doctrine. The Spanish did not lack advanced technology. Their ships and cannons were, in many respects, superior to the English, but their doctrine of employment had become obsolete. This gap between technological capability and strategic thinking represents a danger that remains relevant in the contemporary era, where the pace of technical innovation frequently outstrips the capacity for doctrinal adaptation. The fifth lesson concerns the relationship between communication and operational success. The Armada's inability to coordinate effectively with the Tercios of Flanders, resulting from both technological limitations and planning failures, illustrates how even the best-laid plans can fail when communication systems are inadequate. Finally, the episode teaches us about the persistence of historical myths and their power to distort our understanding of the past. The narrative of the Invincible Armada has proven remarkably resilient to historical evidence, reminding us that history is written not only by the victors, but by those who best understand the power of a compelling story. More than 4 centuries later, the Great Armada still speaks to us about the dangers of hubris, the importance of adaptability, and the complex relationships between planning, execution, and operational reality. Its failure was not the result of a single catastrophic error, but of a cascade of interconnected failures, a lesson that retains all its relevance for strategists, leaders, and planners in the contemporary world. The true legacy of the Great Armada may not be its tragic fate, but the timeless lessons it forces us to contemplate about the limits of power and the nature of strategic failure. History is full of moments that changed the world, and at Chronicas Insolitas, we are dedicated to exploring them with you. If you want to join us in discovering more fascinating stories like this, subscribe to our channel. For you, it's just a click. But for us, it means being able to continue researching and sharing with you the most captivating mysteries of history.